He could certainly do much more. All of us would agree with that. In fact, I think key legislation like securing our elections, like the SAVE Act, and he could have put political capital there, which likely would have pushed it in the direction of it passing, more mass deportations, a bunch of other things. If we agree that that stuff's more important, then I think the debate's over. Because although it's not technically mutually exclusive, it is undoubtable that Trump putting almost all of his political capital in the foreign policy bucket and foreign intervention not only cost him with being able to pressure his own party back home, but it's also probably going to cost them the midterms. Which means that they're not only not going to be able to do and achieve those domestic agendas, but we're going to see Democrats overrule what's already been done, and it likely leads to Democrats winning future presidential elections, which has a very good chance of being more sympathetic to Iran and rolling back all of these victories, which is why it is a unique time, given how corrupt our country's leadership has been for so long. This Trump presidency is a unique time to shore up election security and border security now. Last thing I'll say, I know I've talked about, you mentioned in your opening statement, you said, for example, look how quick they could have closed the border. I think that's an argument for me. I totally agree with you. For years, they let that border porous. And the reason you're going to say, well, they could have addressed root causes with foreign intervention. I disagree, though. I think what that shows is they were more concerned with allying lobbying groups and defense contractors with foreign intervention than actually focusing domestically back home, which is another reason to not worry about aiding our allies in foreign intervention and instead focus on domestic issues.
No, I agree. I agree that they let the border flood. What I was talking more about there is how did Trump shut the border down? What he did was he threatened Mexico with a massive tariff if they didn't put troops on the border, they didn't police their southern border. He went after Colombia and multiple other countries with massive threats of tariffs and economic intervention if they didn't take their illegals back. Colombia being the most notable, but there were several others. He went after Panama for being in Belt Silk Road Initiative, and they're still defending them to this day. A lot of this was done through the threats they were doing with this foreign intervention. They were using this coercion to force these nations to take their people back when they were ultimately all saying no. They all said no to Biden. He's just like, all right, we'll just take them. We do compassion-based immigration over here. It's cool, whatever. But, oh shit, I had the other point for you. What were you talking about right before that?
The idea of,
I'm all out of order.
It's all right. Right before that, I was talking about sort of the idea of Democrats may win the elections, roll back all of the domestic agenda, and the gains that we've had with foreign intervention.
Yeah. So generally, the gains that we have with foreign intervention, it depends on the Democrat who you get in there. If it's Fetterman or some sane person that gets in there, Josh Shapiro, Fetterman, Gretchen Whitmer, a lot of the hopefuls that are looking to run right now, I don't see much of a change coming. Maybe they do a little bit more compassion. Maybe you get a little bit more like Joe Biden saying, well, the Palestinians have some good points while he's still funding Israel, going in and winning that war like base chads that they are. But generally, I would argue that unless you get the crazy leftists, and if you look, man, a lot of Trump's polling went down after the Pretty shooting, and after the Pretty shooting in particular. It really ain't good. It didn't dip that much. The Pretty shooting is when he took a 5-point dip. His immigration approval went from like 55% approval to right now it's sitting at 44. His foreign intervention, like his Israel approval, didn't move that much. I would argue it was the giant dip in his immigration approval and where his economic approval is right now. Right now, he's got Joe Biden bad numbers on both economy and inflation. I would argue that his intervention is probably one of the more popular parts of his policy.
So I disagree, and I'll explain why. First, when it comes to the Pretty thing, I agree with you that did lead to a decline in popularity. I think you've seen more of a decline, particularly in key demographics, such as independents and people that are in his base that are rejecting the Iran conflict. I think that those numbers are going to be more important. However, and I think they're going down. I don't think that's popular with them. However, what I'll say is this. I think that if he had not, you'll acknowledge this, he was hyper-focused on foreign policy even at the time of the Pretty shooting. For me, it's been about 3 to 4 months that it seems like the thrust of Trump's administration has been focused on foreign policy. Had he been focusing more domestically and actually been able to wage a PR battle against the Democrats who were waging this battle and use those resources to actually go after Democrats that were facilitating both quite literally, I think we'll find out through NGOs, etc., the actual uprising that we saw of these left-wing demonstrators, which led to this conflict being inevitable with the Preddy shooting, and gone after the politician that seemed to be paying lip service for it, I think that his approval numbers would have went up. In fact, when it came to independents, the polling suggested actually most of them, even after the Preddy shooting, wanted an increase in deportations. And so to me, what signaled after the Preddy shooting was an initial dip that you would have saw because it's just a terrible situation. But instead of Trump focusing on that and resolving it, it seems that he left Minneapolis. And although you're right, sort of sneaky, some of those policies are still going. The American people don't see it that way because they see the Trump administration focused on Iran. And so the numbers go down even more. And now his net approval, unless I'm mistaken, with immigration is actually decreased, particularly amongst independents, after his focus, even though the policies have remained largely the same. The only difference is the perception because he seems weak. He seems like he backed down. The other thing real quick, just on the pressuring Mexico, I do not accept that as the foreign intervention in the aiding of allies as you outline it. For example, if Germany attacks us tomorrow and we go to war with Germany, you can say, well, technically that's coercive. That's foreign intervention. I disagree. I don't look at it in the same context of what I think the question of foreign intervention is here. Therefore, when I look at the policies of like threatening Mexico, etc., that is self-defense. That is saying these criminals, these terrorists, these cartel members are literally coming through your country directly into ours, and you're going to deal with it. So for me, that's tantamount to self-defense, and it's not a question of interventionism like we're sort of world policing. That is us threatening other countries to secure our own borders, which I put as something different. That I'm okay with. Just to be clear, I'm okay with using the military coercion to actually protect us from real threats that we see in real time in our actual borders. That's a different question than like, well, we fund Ukraine so they could attack Russia, who we don't like. And we think that that gives us some geopolitical victory.
All right, so I feel that there's two arguments I very much need to address in order to hold the pillars underneath my affirmative, and you hit on both of them there. I'd say the one you hit on more is who are our allies. So I'd like to go with that one first, and then we can get into the economic state after that. So who are our allies? Your point about Mexico, your opening introduction about the EU. I would argue these people are no longer the allies that we want. I'd argue that you could call it self-defense. I call it more go fuck yourself for not working with us. Either what you want to call it, the tactics of threatening to stop trading with them, what you were saying about freezing assets, that's what I meant about using our banking system.
Sure.
When we say you can no longer use our banks, you can no longer use our trade routes, you can no longer trade in our global currency, and if you do have that debt, we're no longer going to honor your purchases. That to me is intervention, and that's what Trump was threatening against Mexico to get them to do certain things, Colombia as well. I'd argue also the same thing you said about Europe. I wouldn't say a lot of Europe is our allies anymore. I'd say these people, they've been tariffing us, they've been working against us. Again, you said they've tried to get involved in our elections. I'd say the coalition that Trump built is the Abraham Accords coalition for the first time in human history. Well, in the last 79 years since Israel's existed, all these nations around them that wanted their deaths are now all working together under the Abraham Accords, attacking Iran. Once Iran's out of power, they control one of the most important parts of the world, and they actually have the money, military might to be effective. We are making a coalition with a new set of allies, not a bunch of leftist, pansy-ass liberals whose military can't even, like Germany couldn't even get their tanks out for a march because it was so discombobulated. Like, these people have fallen behind. They're sucking us for fucking money for defense. They're sucking out money for healthcare. We saw Trump's favored nation policies drop the price of medical goods because they were fucking underpaying so much that we had to compensate. When Trump passed that policy, the only reason he was able to do it, and they agreed to it, is because he threatened them with a 50% tariff if they didn't. That is, again, the same thing. 50% tariff is a 50% of a sanction. A sanction is a 100% ban on trade. A 50% tariff on all goods would be half of that. It's just as powerful. I think it's just as relevant as saying a sanction. When you're saying we're going to all of your goods coming into our country are going to get these fucking hands. So I would argue these aren't our allies anymore. Trump is shifting the power dynamic from being allies with Europe, who are these declining countries that aren't wealthy anymore. If you took England and made them a state, they'd be like 48th in GDP. They're nothing. They're trash. They're falling behind and they're importing because they can't fucking keep their country up with the people that they have there. We're moving away from them. We're going to better nations. We got better allies and we're growing. So our allies are now the people that we're working with that are actually leading these wars instead of our allies from 60 years ago that are bleeding us dry.
All right, that's interesting. So that's like a different way than I thought you'd go with it. Fine, fair enough. So you can see that most of the European Union is not our allies. Great. Another question, just real quick for you. Is Ukraine our ally?
I would argue... No, I was right. Okay, I would argue that they are our ally insofar as they are the enemy of our enemy. They are fighting one of our largest geopolitical rivals, and we're able to fund them, to back them, to give them what they need, not lose a single U.S. troop, and see one of the largest armies and the biggest threats to the United States absolutely crumble under the 2.5-year offensive that, again, in the last 2 months, they're now losing.
Okay. But my argument would be that's a different question than an ally. You could, like, for example, like, you could be in a temporary alliance with someone that doesn't make you an ally. Like, I would say that even in a particular conflict, you could say in this conflict they're an ally. I don't think that makes them an ally. For example, the Soviet Union wasn't our ally other than an ally in that particular war. No one would have spoke to the Soviet Union at the time of World War II as being an ally to the United States outside the context of war. I think the same would be true of Ukraine. And I think you would concede if we push on it, because I could say the same thing about European Union countries that you're saying aren't an ally. There are times when we are in a military coalition with them, for example, in exercises to take down terrorists like Boko Haram or ISIS, etc. Well, since they're doing that, then they're our ally. And you're like, no, you announced that European Union and the countries they're in aren't our ally. So for the same context, I'd say Ukraine isn't. Given that so much of either, it depends on how you want to look at it, like military spending, or you even argue that most of the spending that we do in Ukraine is actually money that's kicked back at some point to the United States, right? So if we looked at the majority of actual money that's sent, or the majority of actual incidents of foreign intervention, because remember, I only have to win that it's a net negative. The vast majority of the foreign interventionism we do is Europe. And you're acknowledging they're not our allies. So how's that beneficial? Your prompt was foreign intervention and aiding our allies. And yet the majority of our foreign intervention is not in the aiding of our allies. So how do you square that?
Again, it's a transition. As Trump moves away from NATO, he's been threatening to pull out. He's been threatening to leave it for years and years. And now we're actually seeing some actions because of the rifts caused over first Greenland and now this whole Iran debacle. He's looking pretty serious. He's already making massive cuts. He's making them come and fight if they want to, get the oil out of the strait and whatnot. I see it as we're in a transitionary phase. It's not something that just happens overnight. You don't suddenly stop all your funding here and then here. So you were kind enough to give me the technical definition of interventionism over the common one. So I'm going to give you the technical definition of ally over the common one I was using. So you were definitely, I'll give you that. You were all right. I'd say that, and I have to shift my argument to the reason why we're there is because we made them security guarantees to give up their nukes, and keeping an honest foreign stance at the end of the day, to me, is what is necessary to maintain the golden city on the hill. It's just part of the whole package. We got to adhere to last deals.
Okay. So I think, though, that what we see of this concept of allies, I think that one of the reasons, and I'm happy to get back to Ukraine and Russia, I think that's something that we need to talk about in this debate. But I think with Europe specifically, I think a lot of the reasons that in your explanation and mine that Europe's no longer what we would consider an ally, even though our official government stance is still that they are, I think it's because that they have been so reliant on the United States as an intervening force that it's allowed them to implement sort of progressive policies that were largely the result of the institutions in the United States that were controlling our foreign policy. And I don't mean Israel. I mean the actual institutions such as the State Department, the CIA, the military brass, etc. Those have been increasingly globalist and increasingly left-wing. And I think what you've seen, like, for example, we need only go back to Obama. We can see the tight relationships that he formed with many of the leaders in the European Union, and they were able to embrace that because of U.S. interventionism and leadership. Now we find ourselves ourselves in a position that would have been nigh unthinkable mere 10 years ago, where people like me and you that I don't think are particularly radical, and I think you're even more left-wing than me, are willing to say that our once greatest allies in places like Europe are now antithetical in many ways, largely because of the foreign interventionism. Had we stayed home and allowed them to use their own military and actually be responsible for their own defense and stopped pressuring and intervening on their elections to ensure that left-wing globalists were being elected, I think we'd find ourselves in a far different position. So I think that's another example of why that interventionism's been a failure that made the world, the first world, more left-wing and more globalist.
I think the interventions that we did in elections that actually mattered weren't in any of those EU countries, because technically Ukraine sits outside of the EU, even though they kind of wanted to get in there. So, but yeah, no, I'd argue a lot of these old allies need to go. Maybe not long term. Maybe once we start to pull away, they'll turn the fucking act around and start acting right, because they have done that a couple of times. But yeah, no, I'd argue Trump is building a new coalition with the new world powers, the new place where the money sits, the new place where the power sits, and we're moving away from the Europeans that are suckling off our teat. Just because sometimes an ally turns into a parasite doesn't mean doesn't mean throw the entire baby out with the bathwater on that. That's where I'd probably go with that.
Okay,
if you want to keep going back.
That's fair. So I think, let's be clear. I think this argument, I'll make a concession to you here. Like, you could reasonably say, okay, Rob, but even that's true. Didn't you say we're talking about in the here and now? So if you're arguing, these 20 years, blah, blah, blah. Okay, whatever. But I do think that both of us, if we could, it's not necessarily a one-to-one win. If you win, look, it was effective in the past 30 years, therefore it's effective now. But it certainly helps the case. And if I would say it's ineffective in the past 30 years, it would help my case that it would be ineffective now. So I do think it's worth talking about the history of these things. Given that, right, let's just go through some of the specific conflicts that we've seen that we would say were the most clear-cut examples of intervention and see if you think they were net beneficial. Let's start with the Iraq War. You think it was net beneficial to go to the Iraq War?
Oh, it depends on what part of it. I think the Bush initial plan would have absolutely been net beneficial. I think that shit fell apart. We had a gentleman that we were going to step in and take the government over. It ended up crumbling. He ended up bailing on the entire thing. It turned into a debacle. So at the end of the day, I'd say no, it did not. And that's why we needed to go away from this bad form of neocon nation building interventionism. And that's why I've been using Trump's unilateralist. Trump is more of a unilateralist in foreign intervention. What's good for America? Not, okay, we went in there, bombed their country. Now we need to stay there for 20 years and rebuild their government. Fuck that. That's their job. We're out of there. But now America's better off as a result. So yeah, I'd argue the neocon version of it sucked. And there's a lot of versions that suck.
Well, I mean, that's going to kind of save a lot of time in the debate because, fair enough, I think we could say the same about possibly Afghanistan, Libya, and possibly even Syria, other places that we've seen sort of what I would consider more neocon interventionism. And I also concede this. I'll concede that I think that Trump's idea of foreign policy is different. Look, I myself have been lazy. I've said like neocon regime change wars. There is a difference. I don't think if you advocate for changing regime in a country or limited strikes, that necessarily makes you a regime change. I think there is a fundamental different ideology with Trump. However, I think that many people made the same sort of arguments that you made in your opening statement in those past neocon sort of interventionist type mindsets, and we see how it's turned out. I think it's turned out poorly. Libya, we now have open air slave markets. Afghanistan, trillions of dollars spent, 20 plus years. Thousands of families in the United States have been negatively impacted because their sons and daughters went over to die there, came back with PTSD, wounds, etc. And for what? The same people that we were allegedly going there to fight, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, now they run the show and have one of the biggest air forces in the region. This is the other thing. Historically, we can see that oftentimes what happens, particularly with the military interventions, is we end up arming people that end up being our enemies. So 20 years from now, it's self-fulfilling. We again have to arm people to go fight our enemies. We were allies, for example, in Syria with al-Nusra. I can't go through an airport without having to go through a scanner and getting filled up, which somehow they showed up as metal on my dick at this scanner here the other day. It was terrible. Avarice was sitting there watching it happen. Nonetheless, that's largely because of Al-Qaeda, because of Islamic terrorism. Yet we ally with these people, which is how insane the foreign interventionism comes. We give nuclear weapons to a country like Turkey while we're told that we have to continue to intervene in Syria because if we leave, then our allies, the Kurds, will be genocided by our ally Turkey. So the foreign interventionism seems to cause more confusion than anything else. And just because I think Trump's different, I think that it's still not going to end up positively, and his time would be better spent back home.
So I'm sure you would argue, I'm sure you would agree that, you know, not every version of anything is good. It doesn't mean you throw the whole baby out with the bathwater. When you see maybe some police officer get too aggressive and throw somebody on the ground and break their skull, doesn't mean you have to be anti-policing. Now you can say that individual instance was bad. So that's kind of where I go with that, is neocons were bad. I'd argue Libya was not neocon. Libya was more of the technocrat left-wing interventionist type, where they go in, they aid the rebels the same way the neocons do, but then they pull out. Trump's version of it, the unilateralist, is to fund our allies to go and fight these battles for us, and then to actually have a coalition of our allies go in and oversee. So like the Gaza peace deal, with that, is nobody wants Israel in Gaza. Israel doesn't even want to be in Gaza. They formed a coalition of like 8 to 10 Arab nations in the Gulf region that are all going to go in, police, and rebuild this with some U.S. investment in different sectors and trying to get into that oil a little bit. But generally, this is going to be a Saudi, mostly Saudi because they're the richest and most powerful of them all, a Saudi-led coalition that's going to oversee all this for us. It's a different version of intervention. The reason why Afghanistan failed, if you look at the polling from the region, the first 5-6 years, they loved us there. They saw their standard of living go through the fucking roof. Women were able to go to school. I want to say their life expectancy went up 7 years in the 18 years that we were there. It's fucking insane how quickly it improves. But if you look at what they wanted about 8 to 9 years in, they said they didn't want the U.S. the fuck out. They didn't like us there. They didn't want us there. Our cultures didn't mesh. They wanted the Saudis to come in and to oversee their reconstruction, oversee their new government. And we didn't do that. We were too proud. We were too neocon. We stuck to it. And then it ended up being the giant debacle of the Biden pullout that ruined that was the last straw for his presidency. So I would say that there's a lot of bad versions of it, but even bad versions aside, the overall net good of the policy itself, the giant amount of money that comes in from trade, is completely dwarfed by all these old bad examples that we're now doing away with for the unilateralist stance.
But I think that trade would be possible without like things like sanctions or military force. And like, look, let's be clear. There's another way that you could look at this prompt. I still stand by that we should look at it in the here and now, and whether or not the foreign intervention that we see now. Another way that you could look at it is like, what if you're Trump? What if we're members of the Trump administration and we're coming in and we're talking about like, okay, status quo. Now the 4 years we have under the Trump administration, foreign interventionism isn't a net benefit. And I think that a reasonable way we could interpret what our answer would be, or what the Trump administration's answer would be, is, have they increased or decreased foreign intervention? Now, we, of course, see the hyper examples of it in places like Venezuela or places like Iran. But other than that, I think that the Trump doctrine, for me, one of the most excited I've been was his speech in Riyadh. Right. And the Riyadh speech basically said that there's going to be a new sort of vision that the United States has for the world. And that is, we're basically not interested in interventionism. And they spoke about things like, formerly, we may have questioned human rights abuses and we would have put sanctions. We've done this and that. Now we just want to trade. We're less interested in trying to sort of be this world arbiter of morality and a world police, and we just want beneficial trade. We're not trying to hose you. We want a deal that will benefit your people, but we also want it to benefit our people, and so that is what we're about. If we accept that that is the Trump doctrine, isn't this sort of an admission that, at least according to the Trump team, they think that the foreign intervention that we had seen leading up to that was a net detriment, which is why they pulled back on it?
I mean, they might have a little bit, but at the end of the day, they turned around and ramped it up in certain areas as well. It's true. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's not ending it. It's more of a shift away from some of the old ways that are now bad for us. I'd say that, yeah, you're right. There's some legitimate reasons to gripe, but the hegemony that we give is, I guess I'll move into the economic market now. You brought up the purchasing power of the United States declining. I would argue that if you look at almost every single good in the United States since 1979 to 2019 has dropped in percentage of income spent on that good per household, except for 4 things. And those 4 things are education, housing, healthcare, and I can't remember the last one. This is my Rick Perry moment. I just know there's a 4th. And the reason those 4 things, it's in there. It's in the study.
Real estate, maybe?
I don't fucking, I guess that would be housing. I don't remember. But it's 3 things that have been completely dominated by left-wing politics. They have been making all the policy on healthcare, education, and housing for the last 50 fucking years. And that's why those specific things, you got all these fucking stupid housing policies in cities. I'm actually pro-NIMBY. Democrats used to be fucking pro-democracy. I'm pro-NIMBY. I don't mind that driving up housing prices. What I don't like is the lack of more housing because they're appeasing fucking unions and trying to keep, that's the part I don't like. But housing, education, healthcare, these are the three things that have actually grown into percentages of what our income is spent on since the 70s. Otherwise, we have more purchasing power than ever. So I wouldn't attribute that to intervention. I'd say intervention and keeping military police around the world has brought our trade costs, or has brought our overall costs down due to this trade. Due to comparative advantage from other nations, they can go ahead and make these goods for cheaper, send them here for whatever reason, and then boom, we have cheaper goods, and then we can focus on the bigger things. We can sell airplanes. We can have the most advanced weapons in the world and sell these things that these other nations aren't capable of. The non-fun argument generally. But at the end of the day, I think that we see the money being spread too thin in my mind is not true at all, because a lot of that income comes from this trade that we need police to protect. And you are right, you can have trade without coercion, and generally we do that with nations that we consider equal. But I mean, we've been doing this for 200 years. That's how slavery ended in the West. The UK ended it in all of its colonies. The United States ended it in the United States. And then they said, if you want to trade with us, these two nations that have gone through an industrial revolution before you, you need to also adhere to our demands on human rights and stop slavery in your country too. And they ended up forcing slavery out of the West with that form of coercion. It's been a net good for humankind and for God-given, inalienable American rights laid down in our Declaration of Independence.
Disagree. Don't really care. I find, although I do care about people around the world, when we're talking about issues of the U.S. government, I'm primarily focused on the health and well-being of people in the United States. My theory is that our government should, like every government across the world, should be focused on the citizens of its country and how to improve their lives without intentionally doing harm to places around the world. So, for example, I don't say, well, fuck it, let's just steal Canada's shit. I'm not going to suggest that. But I also don't think that we owe our treasury and blood to enrich the people of Canada. I think it should be focused on, I expect the Canadian government to do the same and every other government in the world, just like I expect you as, I don't know if you're a father, but you as a head of household to primarily take care of your household, me to take care of mine, etc. Works out good. We're not robbing each other, but at the same time, if your kids need glasses and my kids need glasses and I only have money for one pair, it's going to my kids. So that's the way I look. So despite your patriotic speech about human rights across the world, not really factoring majoritarily in to what my consideration of this topic is, that we can talk about it if you want. I think that when we're talking about standard living, I understand what you're saying. And without seeing the data, which I'll fully accept that maybe energy was the fourth cause. I don't know. I don't know. But without seeing it, let's accept that the reason that we see inflation going so high and sort of the value of the purchasing power for like middle class America is because of just these few things. I would say two things. One, the left were allowed to do that because of the focus on foreign power, which led to domestic issues getting out of control and be dominated by these left-wing issues, as right-wingers seem to be more hyper-focused on foreign entanglements that we see. This has certainly been true of the Bush doctrine, right? And unfortunately, I see that creeping up again. So a lot of things, domestic issues that were key on Trump's agenda, mass deportations, we're seeing a little bit of it, but not as much as we should. SAVE Act, we're hardly seeing anything be done on that. We're seeing the Republicans basically stymie Trump's administration, and even left-wing violence and riots, much akin to the George Floyd riots, cropping up again and very little being done about it. On a domestic issue, this again is demoralizing and causing losses, I think, or potential losses in future elections. What I would say is that I think that even if we accept your economic argument that the inflation is these limited sectors, I don't know if I agree, but for the sake of argument, let's say we agree. The problem is that a lot of these good-paying manufacturing jobs have been pissed away. And that's largely because we have chosen as our primary export to be two things, which are dollars and military. That's what we've chosen to do. As a result, we now are in a situation where not only was this path to the middle class of manufacturing disappearing increasingly for young people, which I think is going to be a huge detriment to our country going forward, young people that feel doom and gloom, which is going to lead to them going to socialism, which is going to be a disaster, again, because of the focus on foreign policy intervention. But I think that what you also see is the United States is now reliant on many of those same countries that you'd want us to intervene against for basic needs. So, for example, when we have something like a pandemic, we're reliant on our biggest geopolitical adversary, China, for basic protective equipment and basic antibiotics, etc., because we've been so focused on foreign intervention, we've got rid of the manufacturing sector. Instead, if those resources would have been spent back home and currently would be spent back home, we'd find ourselves in a far better position in the future.
See, it's hard to dispute with a lot of what you're saying because a lot of this is focused on bad versions of intervention, but a lot of these things have all been corrupted by Trump. Even Biden was kind of on board with a lot of the anti-China stuff. Trump has been the number one president to decouple from China. Trump has been the number one president to fight back on their actions on the world stage, at least in the last 30 or so years. And I think it's fantastic and super fucking smart for our future. But even with the SAVE Act, I think this is a little bit, I'm not saying a red herring. I get your argument. It's just a little slightly off topic, but I think that you're kind of attributing the failure of all these things, or the less of an impact of all these things, to foreign intervention, when if you actually dig into them, the devil's in those details. There's a few Democrats in purple states that said they'd be more than willing to come out and vote for the SAVE Act if one thing changes. If they get rid of that vote by mail being illegal in every state, that's the thing that Fetterman would come in on. That's the thing that other purple state people would come in on, because it really is a violation of states' rights to pick their own rules for an election. Wasn't it Oregon has been completely vote by mail for like 25 years now? And it hasn't been an issue until it was an issue. We need better election security. I think overreaching and potentially doing something that unconstitutional, at least the Democrats are like, this is a no stopper for us. We're not accepting this particular clause. It's just them not willing to compromise. They just don't have the seats for it. They could get it done if they worked with the other party, and we could continue intervention exactly the same. The variable that would need to change to pass the SAVE Act is what Congress needs, is to work together. Intervention could not change, and we could see it pass. So I don't think the things necessarily mesh up as nicely as you were trying, as your eloquent argument is making them sound.
Okay, so this is an interesting argument. So when it comes to, would you agree if you had your druthers that vote by mail is a bad idea? You might say it's up to the state to allow it, but if you're like the governor of a state or you're a politician of a state, would you say, actually, there are problems with security of this? I would prefer we not do this, except in cases of emergency, military service, etc.
I'd say vote by mail is about as bad as sanctuary policies. Yes.
Okay.
It's up there with that.
Great. So then you just have a question of the constitutionality, because you say each state should have the right to make those decisions for themselves.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So given that, here's what I would say. I don't think it's red herring, and here's why. I think that if Trump put enough political capital on his own party and hyper-focus on it, he would actually be able to reach the numbers necessary in the Senate to force a talking filibuster and then get this passed. Do you think that's possible if he put all of his eggs in we're running ads every day, we're talking about fuck you Cornyn, fuck you Murkowski, and we're really putting pressure on them? Do you think it would be possible?
I don't, because the talking filibuster has a lot of really specific rules to it. I don't know if you want to dig into that topic, but I don't.
Yeah, fair enough. It's enough to say if you would have conceded, it would have made it easier. I'll just say I disagree. I think that it would be possible to force either an elimination of the filibuster or a talking filibuster, or at least make that a mainstream issue. And so I think even without Democrats, we're talking about two different ways to pass the SAVE Act. Your way would be, we could keep doing what we're doing foreign policy, don't have to invest that much political capital, just get rid of the vote by mail portion, something we both agree we don't like vote by mail, right? Or my way, which is says, no, I think the vote by mail is important, and I think that if he invested his political capital domestically, it would be more likely to be passed. Here's the thing. Even if it would be overruled by the courts, I don't necessarily think this is unconstitutional, because I think that when it comes to federal office holders, there should be a stake in ensuring, for me in Pennsylvania, that there's not cheating going on in Oregon, or a system that's easy to cheat going on in Oregon that could force a president on me that I will be under. There has to be a reasonable expectation that there is a secure system across all 50 states. And so I think this would fall in line with that. We'll see. I'm not an attorney. But even if they lost that constitutional challenge at the courts, I think that this would massively help Republicans in elections going forward, because the eye would then be placed on the Democrats, who are so viciously fighting to allow vote by mail. And this would lead to state victories where people in these states, because I think vote by mail is largely going to be found to be unpopular. And I think that you would see more Republican wins and a better chance of getting vote by mail eliminated, even if it was ruled unconstitutional at the state level. So in all ways, I think that the focus domestically would be better when it comes to the SAVE Act. I'm not saying, I'm not going to bullshit you. I'm not saying it's 100% likely to occur that way, but I think it's such an important issue for future elections. I think if we got rid of vote by mail, I think, look, I'll call it straight out. I don't know what you think about this. I think Democrats want it because they fucking cheat, right? And as long as that, even with IDs, you're able to fucking cheat with vote by mail, right? Because what you're allowed to do is things like ballot harvesting, etc. And even though someone has an individual ID, you can fill out their ballots for them and, selectively lose this, that, the other. It's easy to commit fraud. There's voter rolls aren't cleaned in all these states. Hundreds of thousands of dead people on the rolls. All of that would be possible. Even ID, it's hard to prove an ID voting by mail. So even if you had voter ID, it would be hard to enforce that. So for that reason, securing elections is a fundamental issue going forward. And I think the last thing I'll say, then I'll give you the word. Like, if you're like, okay, all foreign interventionism has actually not been net beneficial in the past with the sort of Obama wing of it or the Biden wing of it or the Hillary wing of it versus the neocon wing of it. Well, the problem is if the elections aren't secured, we're guaranteed to get that type of interventionism again in the future. So to me, the key issue has to be making incremental domestic change to important issues like the border and elections. Else we'll find ourselves having the same conversation 8 years from now.
So I do agree that definitely changes need to be made, and they have been being made on a lot of that has to do with the state level, like Georgia, even with Brian Kemp, who would bashed heads with Trump, passed some pretty damn strict election laws after the 2020 election even, and people say he was one of the people that abetted cheating. So I'd say the Republicans have done a fairly solid job on that on the state level. It's now the Save America Act. So a couple of weeks ago, Trump actually started getting really big into pushing this. He rebranded it from the Save Act to the Save America Act. He's been talking about it a lot more in his speeches and whatnot. But I think the argument that you're making here that you're going to have to go against is if Republicans come out and they do all that PR, they do all that press, they do all that talking about, look at this bill that's going to save our elections, and we're going to do that by making sure you have ID. Look at that. That's an 80-20 issue. Everyone wants that shit. Absolutely. And then Democrats come out and say, yeah, we like that. What we don't like is this pork packed into it that's illegally going to control our state elections in a way that our voters don't want. That's a really strong argument. I didn't vote for X bill with a good name because Y thing that was unrelated or bad was packed into it. That's the argument that Bernie made in 2016 that got him a massive amount of points against Hillary when they started bringing up how he didn't vote for the Defense Against Women Act. That's Ted Cruz used that in the 2016 elections. And for a while, he was almost neck and neck with Trump. It's a solid argument if you make it properly. I didn't vote for that bill because it had a poison pill in it. That usually the American people sympathize with that, and that's what you'd be up against if you did all this with the Democrats. Is they'd come out and say, we like the good parts of this bill, it's the bad parts that we're not going to vote for, and the Republicans refuse to even talk to us about it. That is a tactic that has worked in the past, and you got to remember the Democrats control almost, I think it's 8 of the 10 largest media outlets in press and news. They control 6 of the top 7 social media websites, and that's why when you see people freak out online that one space lets people talk, right-wingers talk freely, that's so bad, and it's a Nazi space. It's the only social media website that Republicans can even speak freely on. The rest are completely controlled by the other side. They have a captivation of the narrative in a way that the Republicans don't. They're going to lose that battle all the time. So I feel like it wouldn't work. And again, the talking filibuster has its downsides. They really could get this passed with just moderating, taking out one of the 3 clauses. 2 of them still get through. Everyone gets a little something, something. Not everyone leaves 100% happy. That's how government's supposed to work. And that has nothing to do with intervention. We could solve this problem and keep the same exact intervention as a variable. I'm trying to do algebra with my argument.
Yeah, no, I understand. The argument is it wouldn't take a lot of political capital from Trump. In fact, it could take none because the Senate Republicans could do this on their own, basically. I understand the argument, right? What I'll say is, I think overarchingly, if Trump was focused more on this, it makes it more likely to be passed. I think that's undeniable. And I think that even though you could possibly be right, it's sort of difficult to understand which of us would be more likely to be right. I'll fully acknowledge that. I do think that intentionally taking out a provision that's one of the most key ones for election security is a mistake. I don't think that should occur. And, what good is it? It's like sort of being like, oh yeah, we'll pass this bill saying that we'll kick out illegals, except any illegal that comes through Mexico. It's like, why not just compromise and take that portion out? I think it'd be a mistake because the thrust of what we're trying to solve would not be solvable with that sort of compromise. So I think that becomes an issue on that. Nonetheless, again, I guess what the thrust, I think all of this is an interesting conversation. I think the thrust, though, if we get down to nuts and bolts of what we're talking about here specifically, is sort of the interventions that we've seen under Trump right now. So the glaring example and the elephant in the room would be Iran, right? If you concede, as you did, that the domestic issues are more important than the foreign issues, but you think that both are achievable at the same time, like, how do you square the fact that the Iran conflict is massively unpopular, particularly with independents, and that makes it far more likely that Democrats win the House and stymie any domestic agenda in the next 2 years?
When I look at the aggregates on RCP, I can see that his economy is about 15 points, or his inflation handling is about 15 points less popular than Iran. His economy is about 10 points less popular than Iran, and Iran's about a half a point more popular than Trump. So I would argue that the Iran conflict is not what's dragging him down. He was being balanced out. He has positive approval ratings in crime. He has positive approval ratings in border security, immigration. When immigration tanked from 54 to 44, it took down his overall average significantly. If he improved his economy, he could go around and blow up the entire fucking world. He could go blow up them and blow up them and blow up them. He dropped this fucking trade war that's responsible for potentially 40% of our inflation year to year. We could definitely see the economy
would you call that trade war interventionism?
Yes. I think it's got its positives though, man. It's hard to argue. Its positives have not been economic. Its positives have been national security, military, and things of that nature. The fentanyl tariffs against the southern countries below us completely stopped immigration. Fentanyl's been completely cut off. Like they have been effective. They just haven't been effective economically yet. It's going to take some time before we got $8 trillion of investment that we're not even going to see the positive of for 5 fucking years. So we will eventually see a plus from this. We're starting to see it right now in tech and IT. You're getting a giant, robust boom of high-paying, blue-collar, $30 to $40 an hour jobs blowing up all over the cities. There's not enough IT and tech workers in the United States right now. And with the changes to H-1B visas and less people coming in due to Trump's immigration policy, we're hurting. We're fucking hiring people that don't even have any experience right now in my industry because we're hurting so fucking bad for IT and programming. It's awesome. First time since I graduated college, it's this way. So I would argue that some of these economic changes are going to take some time to materialize. It's hard to judge after just a year, but you're right in the current state. They haven't borne fruit enough for me to argue that version of interventionism. And also, to what you said, who is right, who's wrong, my metric here is for you to say at the end of this, wow, you really have improved a substantial amount from 3 years. That's it. That's a win to me. So that's all I care about.
For me, one, we don't know how those things will end. So it's interesting you say, well, the reason is because our economy is not doing good enough popular because of this other form of interventionism. That would seem to suggest if we're just focusing on the prompt in the second Trump administration, that interventionism has led to people being down on Trump, according to you, which is making it very likely that Democrats win, which will then roll back all of this stuff, which means that it would have been far better to do this sort of interventionism in the future and not now, given that there are important things domestically that we need Trump to continue winning on, such as the border, which is more important, as you've conceded. So even in that context, I think we could see whether or not the interventionism, even if you say, well, there are other benefits, may be true, but is it net beneficial if it leads to the predictable outcome of Democrats winning and then rolling it back? No, it wouldn't be. And that's the most likely scenario, in your own words, based on not just the Iran attack, but the interventionism of the trade war, right? Secondly, I think that there's sort of something going on here that you're not taking into account, which is, to me, the reason that his numbers are down on things like the economy and even things like his handling of the border is because he shifted focus away from not just working on those issues, but selling those issues, and instead focuses his political capital and his selling on the foreign policy. And so what happens is, actually, the Democrats, with the massive monolithic media that they have and their ability to spin a narrative, was making the economy sound far poorer than it actually was. For example, GDP was going down, but you would expect that if you drive the number of federal employees to the lowest level since the 1960s. The vast majority of jobs being created are going to citizens and native borns of the United States, as opposed to what we saw at the Biden administration, it was going to people that were foreign born. So those numbers are a bit misleading when the Democrats sell it of like, well, job growth's down. And we can see that under Biden, real wage growth, which is wage growth minus inflation, was negative under the 4 years of Biden. With Trump, it's about 1.3%, if I remember. So the economic numbers, while not great, and people are still suffering from 4 years under Biden, actually decent. The problem is, as with many things with Trump, they don't do a good job of selling it to the American people, right? And so what happens is they're more focused selling other shit. So right now, what are they selling? They're not selling mass deportations. They're not selling how good they've been on the border. They're not selling the SAVE Act, and they're not selling the economic victories. They're not even selling tariffs anymore. They're selling Iran. They're selling Venezuela. And the problem is, those on their face, no matter how much energy you're putting into it, just aren't popular. And so what happens is, people are now down on these other issues that if the narrative was different and Trump was putting more sort of political capital into, I think that he would have more of a gain in it.